The desert wasn't supposed to rain, not in mid-September, not like this. But there it was, pouring. Heavy, sideways rain that slapped against the windshield of Nate Harding's rust-bitten pickup like it meant to punish something. Or someone. Nate sat in the driver's seat, engine off, his fingers loose around the wheel. He didn't check the radio, didn't check the time. He just stared ahead, watching the skeletal outline of a closed gas station blur into nothing behind the curtain of rain. It had been a quiet drive, miles of silence stretching like the scars across his back. That kind of silence always made the past louder. A drop of water trickled down from the roof and tapped his shoulder. He didn't flinch. Rain never bothered him. Fire did. He shifted in his seat and rolled his shoulder, the one that still ached when it got cold. It tugged at the scar above his collarbone, a shiny, puckered reminder of the night his life turned to ash. The night the sirens didn't scream soon enough. The night his wife died. He could still hear her voice sometimes. Not clearly. More like a whisper left behind in an empty room. That voice was fading now. Like everything else. He reached for the old thermos on the passenger seat, but before he could unscrew the cap, there was a knock on the window. Not a loud one. Just 3 soft taps. He blinked, turned. A small boy, soaked to the bone, stared at him through the glass. He looked 7, maybe 8, skin pale, dark hair plastered to his forehead. His jacket was too thin for this weather. He wasn't crying, but his eyes said everything. Nate rolled the window down halfway. She fell, the boy stammered. My mom. She's not waking up. It took Nate a second. Then he opened the door. Rain slammed into him like a wall. The boy stepped back, pointed toward the side of the gas station where an old wooden awning sagged over a strip of cracked concrete. Nate followed, his boots splashing in a shallow pool. She was there, slumped beneath the awning, clutching a bundled-up baby to her chest. Her skin was pale, damp with sweat. Next to her sat a girl, maybe 5, with wide, frightened eyes. On the other side, another child, a toddler, sat rocking, thumb in her mouth, all of them soaked, all of them silent. The woman wasn't dead. Nate checked her pulse. Faint but steady. Feverish. He looked at the boy, who was watching him like someone trying to decide if a stranger was safe or dangerous, like he'd already been wrong before. Help us, the boy said. He didn't plead. He just said it. Nate hesitated. The kind of hesitation that comes from knowing too much. This wasn't his problem. Not anymore. Not after the city, the fire, the trial, the headlines. Not after losing his badge and his name and everything he thought would last. He had nothing to offer anymore. But then the baby coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made the girl next to her clamp her hands over her ears, and Nate found himself pulling off his coat. He wrapped it around the baby first, then lifted the woman into his arms. She was light, too light. He nodded to the boy. Get the others, he said. By the time they were all in the truck, the woman shivering quietly on the back seat, the toddler curled up against her chest, Nate was already driving, toward the nearest town, 10 miles east. Willow Creek. It wasn't home, not anymore. But it had a clinic, and a roof, and lights. The road was slick. Thunder rolled somewhere off to the south. The kids didn't talk. The boy sat stiffly beside him, eyes locked on the speedometer. The girl clung to her sister like she might disappear if she let go. The truck smelled like wet wood and old coffee. The wipers squeaked. Nate's knuckles were white on the wheel. He didn't ask names. He didn't give his. They reached the clinic just before midnight. The nurse on duty looked up, eyebrows raised, when Nate walked in carrying the unconscious woman. She didn't ask questions, just pointed him toward an open room. She'll need fluids, she said. Probably rest, antibiotics. Was she out there long? Long enough, Nate muttered. He didn't stay inside, just made sure the woman was safe, then went back out to the truck. The boy followed him halfway to the door, then stopped. "Are you leaving?" the boy asked, barely audible. Nate turned, met the boy's eyes. Didn't answer, because he didn't know yet. Instead, he sat in the cab. Rain still fell, softer now, a steady hush like someone brushing their hand gently over the world. He leaned back in the seat, arms folded, watching the glow of the clinic windows through the glass. His coat was gone. So was the last shred of distance he'd kept between himself and the rest of the world. He didn't know their names. He didn't know their story. But for reasons he couldn't explain, Nate Harding wasn't on the road anymore. He was here, still, waiting. And inside the clinic, in a quiet room under flickering fluorescent light, the woman stirred for the first time. Her eyes opened, slowly, weakly. And the first thing she saw was not her children. It was him. Nate didn't sleep. He closed his eyes a few times, but his mind didn't let him drift. Not fully. Not with the rain still whispering outside and the image of that boy's face, wet, watchful, waiting, burned into the backs of his eyelids. He told himself it was temporary. One night. Maybe two. Enough to make sure they weren't dying. Enough to quiet whatever was clawing at his chest. Then he could go. The sky was just beginning to gray when he stepped out of the truck. Early light pooled across the sidewalk in soft ribbons. The rain had stopped, but the world was still dripping. Leaves, gutters, the edges of the building. It all shimmered in silence. He stretched his shoulders, stiff from the cramped cab, then walked into the clinic. The place was half asleep. A young nurse gave him a nod from behind the counter. She looked tired but kind. "She's stable," she said softly. "Fever broke around 4 a.m. The kids are with her. Room 3. Nate hesitated. He hadn't planned on walking in, but his legs moved anyway. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and something sweeter, maybe chamomile. The floor creaked once beneath his boots. And when he reached the doorway, he paused. Inside, the woman was awake. Barely. She lay propped against a thin pillow, skin pale, eyes sunken with exhaustion, but she was conscious. Holding her baby in one arm while her free hand gently stroked the hair of the toddler curled beside her. The older two sat on plastic chairs near the window. The boy, same wary expression, noticed Nate immediately. He didn't say anything, but the girl beside him gave a tiny wave. Nate almost turned around, then the woman spoke. "You stayed." Her voice was hoarse but sure. Nate cleared his throat. "Didn't mean to." Her lips curved into something that might have been a smile. "I didn't mean to end up here either." He walked in slowly, stopping a few feet from the bed. "They said you'd be okay." "I will be," she said. "I think." There was a pause, the kind that stretches not because there's nothing to say, but because saying it would make things real. "They're your kids?" he asked finally. She nodded. "All 4. He looked at them, at the boy, sitting like he was bracing for the next disaster, at the girl holding a crayon too tight in her fist, at the baby, still curled against her chest like a question mark. "You don't have to tell me anything," Nate said. "I know," she said. "But you should know this. My name's Grace, and if you hadn't stopped, I don't think I'd be breathing right now." He looked away. Grace studied him, her voice softer. "What's your name?" "Nate." She waited. Then, gently, "Just Nate." He gave a dry smile. "It's all that's left of me." That should have been the end of it. But the toddler, half asleep, stirred at the sound of his voice and reached out instinctively, tiny fingers brushing Nate's hand. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Nate let her hold it. It was small, barely a touch. But it anchored something in him. He pulled a chair closer and sat down. They didn't talk much after that. The room fell into a quiet rhythm, the rustle of blankets, the scratch of crayon on paper, the soft breathing of a baby. Eventually, a social worker came, middle-aged, polite, clipboard in hand. She asked questions gently but firmly. Grace answered most of them honestly, but her shoulders grew tighter with every word. The father of the children was not safe. They had no extended family nearby, no address, no job. Grace had been surviving on the last of her savings and the kindness of strangers. The social worker smiled tightly. "We'll help place you somewhere temporary." At that, the boy, Caleb, Nate learned, stiffened. "We don't need another shelter," he muttered. Grace looked down, said nothing. Nate stared at the clipboard. His jaw flexed. He shouldn't get involved. He didn't belong in this. He didn't know these people. His life was a string of broken bridges. He wasn't qualified to build anything anymore. "But is there a place?" Nate asked quietly. "Where they could stay? For a few nights? That isn't a shelter?" The social worker turned. "Are you offering?" Nate hesitated, then nodded. "Just a few days," he added, "until she's stronger." Grace looked at him then, really looked, not with suspicion, not even with hope, but with something gentler, grateful, but cautious, like a woman who knew how to measure every ounce of trust she gave. And Nate, he just looked away and said, almost to himself, "Maybe just this once." The house was smaller than Grace expected. It stood at the edge of Willow Creek, half hidden by overgrown brush and the remains of a white picket fence leaning like tired shoulders. The porch sagged. The windows were smudged with old dust and new rain. But there was a light on in the kitchen, warm, golden, flickering like it wasn't sure whether to stay. Nate hadn't been back in over 2 years. Not since the fire, not since the funerals. But the key was still under the chipped planter on the porch just where she'd left it. He unlocked the door without speaking, pushed it open. The air inside smelled faintly of pine and something older. Ash, maybe. Memory. Grace stepped in behind him, holding her baby tight. Caleb followed, his arms wrapped around his sister Ava. Lily, the youngest, clung to Grace's jeans like a barnacle. The floor creaked under their feet. Nate moved through the house in silence. He didn't touch much, just flicked on lights with hesitant fingers like each switch might trigger something. The kitchen looked lived in a past life sort of way. Old mugs hung on a wooden rack. A checked curtain still framed the window over the sink. On the counter sat a single wooden chair with one broken leg, the kind of thing you say you'll fix but never do. Grace could feel the ghosts in the walls. Not angry ones, just quiet, waiting. She set Lily down and unzipped her coat. "You sure about this?" she asked. "No," Nate said. "But you need somewhere, and I need—" He paused, swallowed. "I need to stop running." She didn't press him, didn't ask what he was running from. The truth was she didn't want to explain her story either. Not yet. Ava tugged at her sleeve. "Can we stay here, Mommy? Just for a little while?" Grace looked at Nate. He nodded once. "Yeah, you can stay." Caleb didn't say anything. He just walked into the living room, looked around, and picked up a photo frame from the floor. It held a picture of a younger Nate, clean-shaven in uniform, standing next to a woman with laugh lines and sunburned cheeks. He put it back down gently, face down. Nate watched, but said nothing. The rest of the day passed in quiet repairs. Nate cleaned out the small guest room, found a crib in the garage, and set it up with mechanical, almost military precision. Grace washed the kids' clothes in the sink and hung them by the fire to dry. By evening, the house smelled of soap and dust and something like beginning again. At dinner, they shared canned soup warmed on the stove and slices of toast Nate didn't remember buying. Grace sat the kids around the old wooden table. Lily clapped when Nate handed her a spoon, and for a second, just one, he smiled, a tired, flickering kind of smile. But real. After dinner, Grace tucked the kids into the guest room. They were too excited to sleep. Ava insisted the house wasn't haunted. Caleb didn't answer when Grace kissed his forehead. Lily fell asleep mid-sentence, thumb in mouth. Grace, stepped into the kitchen to find Nate sitting at the table, mug in hand, staring into steam. She joined him quietly. "You have a nice home?" she said. He gave a short laugh. "It used to be. Before everything." "What happened?" she asked gently. Nate hesitated. "My wife died here," he said, voice flat. "House fire. I was on duty. Out at a call. Got there 2 minutes too late." He didn't look at her. Just kept staring at the steam. "They said it was faulty wiring, but the press wanted a story, so they made one. Said I ignored protocol. Abandoned my post. I didn't fight it. What was the point?" Grace didn't speak. "After that," he went on, "people stopped calling me Nate. Started calling me a coward. Or worse. So I left." The kitchen hummed in the silence that followed. Just the clock ticking and the wind brushing against the windows. Grace reached out, slowly, and rested her fingers on his hand. "You're not a coward," she said. "You're here." Nate didn't answer, but he didn't pull away either. A log in the fireplace popped and Lily stirred in the other room. The house settled around them like a long exhale. Outside, the stars began to break through the thinning clouds. Grace stood. "I should get some sleep." Nate nodded. "I'll lock up." As she stepped away, she paused at the doorway and turned back. "Thank you for letting us in." He looked up at her, his eyes softer than they had been in days. "Maybe just this once," he said again. But this time it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like hope. The wind had changed. Nate felt it before he saw it. The way the curtains near the living room window trembled just slightly, as if sensing something uneasy moving in. Outside, the sky was clear, but inside the house the air had shifted. That night the kids finally slept early. Caleb, after much reluctance, let Nate read part of a tattered adventure book by the fireplace. Ava fell asleep holding Nate's old flannel shirt like a blanket. Lily curled against her sister, thumb tucked in. It was quiet again, but not empty. Grace stood by the sink, drying a plate, her fingers moving slow and rhythmic. Nate watched her, from across the kitchen, sitting at the table, a half-drunk mug of tea growing cold between his hands. She hadn't said much all day, neither had he. They'd cleaned the garage, repaired a broken closet door, fixed the loose step on the porch. The kind of chores that filled time but left space for nothing else. Now the space was shrinking. "Do you ever stop?" he asked quietly. She looked up. "Stop what?" "Carrying everything like it's going to break if you set it down." Grace folded the dish towel slowly. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. "You don't have to tell me," Nate said. "I just..." He shook his head. Sometimes silence weighs more than words. She came to the table and sat across from him. The dim kitchen light caught her features, soft, shadowed, strong in a quiet way. She folded her hands, then unfolded them again. "My husband used to say I had a talent for disappearing," she began. "Not physically, emotionally. I'd smile, say I was fine, and just fade out." Nate listened, his gaze steady. He liked that about me. At first. She stared at her hands. Then he started making it a rule. Don't speak unless spoken to, don't question, don't disagree, don't be inconvenient. She paused, then met Nate's eyes. I stayed longer than I should have. Told myself it wasn't abuse because he never left bruises where people could see. But the ones you can't see, they don't heal any faster. Nate said nothing. He understood the language of silence. He never hit the kids, not yet. But I saw it coming. In the way his voice snapped. The way Caleb flinched when doors closed too fast. One night I waited until he fell asleep, packed a bag, and left. She exhaled like she'd been holding that breath for years. Nate looked down at his hands, rough, burned, calloused from work that no longer saved anyone. I used to be the guy who ran toward fire, he said, voice low. People called it brave. But when the fire came for my own house, I wasn't there. She looked at him, eyes softening. They said I should have noticed sooner. That it was my fault. My wife, Emily. She was making tea. Probably turned away for a second. Faulty outlet. Kitchen went up like dry pine. He paused. His throat tightened. I made it back 3 minutes too late. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Like the silence held space for the dead, for regret, for everything neither of them had ever said out loud until now. Grace reached out and turned his hand palm up. Her fingers brushed the old burn scar that twisted across the inside of his wrist. It healed ugly, she murmured. Yeah. But it healed. Nate let that settle. Then nodded, just once. For 3 days nothing happened. And somehow that felt like everything. Nate wasn't sure when the silence in the house had stopped sounding hollow. Somewhere between the sound of tiny footsteps in the morning and the smell of Grace's coffee, brewing in the old tin pot, the house began to feel lived in. Not just remembered, not just tolerated, but real. On the second morning, Lily walked into the kitchen barefoot and climbed onto his lap without a word. She pressed her cheek against his flannel shirt, yawned, and fell asleep again. Nate didn't move for nearly an hour. Ava followed him everywhere. She handed him nails while he patched the fence, asked questions he didn't know how to answer, and started referring to the sagging porch swing as ours. She used the word casually, but it stuck. Caleb was slower to trust, but Nate understood that. The boy had too much weight behind his eyes for someone so young. He didn't say much, but he watched, measured. And when he finally helped Nate carry wood into the shed without being asked, Nate knew that something had shifted. As for Grace, she settled into the rhythm like someone relearning how to exhale. She found a notebook in one of Nate's kitchen drawers, old, mostly blank, and started scribbling grocery lists, sketches of the garden she wanted, bedtime poems for Lily. She smiled more, even laughed once or twice. Soft things, things that made Nate's chest ache a little when he wasn't ready, and still no one talked about what came before. Not yet. On the fourth evening, Nate lit a fire in the backyard pit. The kids roasted marshmallows using old hangers, their laughter rising like warm smoke into the dusk. Grace stood by the porch, arms folded, sweater loose on her shoulders, hair up in a messy knot that Nate realized he liked more than he should have. I forgot what this feels like, she said. What? Peace. Even if it's borrowed. Nate looked at the fire. It's not borrowed. Not if you're building it. She smiled, but didn't answer. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't full of pain anymore. It was full of things unsaid, kind things, frightening things, maybe even hopeful things. After the kids were tucked in that night, Nate lingered in the kitchen. Grace washed a few plates, slow and quiet, as the house hummed around them. You okay? He asked. She glanced at him. Yeah. It just feels dangerous. To get used to this. He nodded. Yeah, I know that feeling. A moment passed. Then another. Do you ever think about starting over? She asked, drying her hands. Nate leaned against the counter. I used to. But I think I was always hoping to get the old life back, not build a new one. Grace considered that. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe we're all waiting for something that won't return. Then what do we do? She looked at him then, eyes tired but honest. We build something new, even if it scares us. They stood like that for a long moment. Nothing moved but the kitchen clock and the faint flicker of the porch light outside. Then Grace turned toward the hall. Good night, Nate. He didn't answer until after she was gone. Good night, Grace, he said softly, to no one. The next morning, Caleb helped Nate fix the porch swing. They didn't talk much, but there was a rhythm to the work. 2 sets of hands, 1 broken chain, and a stubborn hinge that refused to stay straight. We should paint it, Caleb said at one point. Nate raised an eyebrow. You got a color in mind? Green, the boy said. Like grass, or something alive. Nate looked at him, and then with a small smile, he nodded. Green it is. Later that day, Grace and Ava gathered rocks from the stream and lined them in a circle. near the garden bed. We'll call it the promise circle, Ava explained, because promises have to be planted like seeds. Grace wrote the words in chalk on the porch step. Nate didn't erase it. That evening, after dinner, Lily climbed onto Nate's lap. Again. She wrapped her little fingers around his thumb and said, "You're not scary. You're warm." Nate blinked hard but didn't speak. Grace watched from across the room, and for the first time since arriving, she let herself lean back, on the couch, just for a minute, just long enough to feel the way her body had been bracing all this time, and how, for once, it didn't need to. But peace is always temporary in stories like theirs. At midnight, Nate sat alone on the back steps, listening to the wind move through the trees. He felt it again. The shift. Something off. A low creak, distant, from somewhere beyond the edge of the yard. He stood, walked toward the fence. Nothing there. Just wind, just shadows. But he'd been a firefighter long enough to know what it felt like. Those few seconds before the fire catches hold. That moment when the air isn't hot yet, but it's about to be. He went inside. Locked every door. Checked every window. Just in case. Then he walked to the kids' room, watched them sleep. Checked the baby monitor Grace had salvaged from a thrift store. Listened to the soft rise and fall of breath. When he turned back, Grace stood in the hallway, watching him. "Something wrong?" she whispered. "Not yet," Nate said. "But I've learned to listen when the world goes too quiet." She looked at him, her hand resting against the wall for balance. "We'll be okay," she said, almost like a prayer. Nate wanted to believe her, but shadows don't knock. They wait. The first sign wasn't loud. It was a feeling, like the wind, had teeth. The following morning, Nate woke before sunrise. He brewed coffee in the quiet kitchen, the smell warming the old house like breath on cold glass. Grace was still asleep. The kids, too. The world hadn't started moving yet. But something in him already knew. The mail flag on the road had been tilted sideways when he walked out to check it. He hadn't put it up. He hadn't checked the mail in days. The flag was small, easy to overlook. But to someone trained in emergencies, it was like spotting a fuse just before it lit. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the fields beyond the fence, stillness, morning dew, crows. But something was wrong. Inside, Grace stirred in the hallway. "You're up early," she said, tugging her sweater closed. Her hair was down, messy, soft, but her voice held tension. "So are you," Nate said. "I had a dream," she murmured, "but it wasn't mine. It was from before. I think he's looking." Nate didn't ask who she meant. He already knew. Grace sat at the table. Nate poured her a mug. She held it like a shield between her hands. "He knows my patterns," she said. "I used to call my sister when we were on the road, but last week I stopped. It's possible." She told him something she wouldn't mean to. Nate clenched his jaw. "We can talk to Sheriff Whitaker. He's decent, quiet, but he listens." "I'm not ready to make this town choose sides," Grace whispered. "Not yet. Not unless I know he's really coming." Nate looked at her, then at the window, at the open space between their small home and the woods beyond. He didn't say it aloud, but something inside him had already shifted. "I've chosen. If it comes to sides, I've already chosen." That night he slept on the couch with his boots on. The fire burned low in the grate. The house creaked in familiar places. Wind brushed the eaves. Somewhere a coyote cried. And then, just past 2 a.m., a motion light blinked on outside. Nate sat up fast. Quiet. He moved to the front window, pulled the curtain half an inch, held his breath. There, just outside the porch gate, was a man. Still, waiting. Wearing a gray hoodie and jeans, he stood too far for clear detail, but close enough for Nate to see the curve of his jaw. Smiling. as if he'd already been inside. Nate's hands curled into fists. He stepped away from the window, grabbed the crowbar he kept by the door, and moved toward the back hallway. Grace was already awake, standing in the shadows holding Lily. "It's him," she said. Nate nodded. "Keep the kids inside. Lock the back door. No lights." "What are you going to do?" "Ask him why the hell he's here." "Nate." Grace's voice cracked, but he was already moving. The air outside was bone-sharp and quiet. Nate stepped onto the porch, crowbar behind his leg, his body square. He didn't speak right away. The man didn't flinch. "Long time," the man said, casual, like they were two friends meeting by accident. Nate didn't respond. "I was wondering when I'd find her," the man continued. "Took longer than I thought. She's clever, I'll give her that." "What do you want?" The man tilted his head. "My kids. They're not your anything." The man laughed, short, low. "You think because she landed in your arms, that makes you their savior? Hero complex, huh? You look the type." Nate's grip on the crowbar tightened. "You came to her house," Nate said coldly. "Middle of the night. That tells me exactly what kind of man you are." "Oh, I'm worse than that," the man said. "And if you keep standing there pretending you matter, I'll show you just how bad it gets." Nate stepped down from the porch. "I'm not pretending." The two men stood face to face. No moon, just porch light humming above. "I don't care what papers you have," Nate said. "I don't care what stories you tell. Those kids are safe now. And if you try to touch even one of them—" "What?" the man interrupted, stepping closer. Nate didn't raise the crowbar. He didn't need to. His voice lowered, steeled. "If you try to take them, you'll have to go through me, and I don't fall easy anymore." A beat passed, and then headlights swept across the field. Sheriff Whitaker's cruiser. The man cursed under his breath. Took a step back. "Another time," he muttered. He walked away before the lights reached them. Nate didn't chase him. He just stood there, hands shaking. Not with fear, with something fiercer. Conviction. Inside, Grace sat on the floor with the kids, wrapped in blankets, her arms trembling around them. Ava cried silently. Caleb stared at the door. Lily asked if the bad dream was over. "It is now," Nate said, stepping in, breathing hard. Grace looked up at him. Her eyes said everything. "Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm scared. Don't go." Nate dropped to his knees beside her. For the first time, he didn't feel like a man offering help. He felt like part of something, fragile, messy, worth protecting. Grace placed her hand on his chest, over his heartbeat. Her palm trembled. "I don't know how to keep them safe forever," she whispered. "You don't have to," Nate said. "You just have to keep them safe tonight. And tomorrow we try again." The fire crackled behind them. The house closed in around their fear, but this time they were facing it together. The smell reached him first. Smoke, acrid, sharp, alive. It hit Nate like a memory, but this time it wasn't in his head. He was halfway through chopping wood behind the shed when he smelled it, faint but familiar, trailing in from the west. A wind shift carried it closer, wrapped in something worse. Gasoline. His blood turned cold. He dropped the axe and ran. By the time he reached the house, Grace was already at the window, eyes wide. The kid stood frozen behind her. The late afternoon sun threw long shadows across the walls, but it wasn't the light making her face pale. It was the thin line of smoke rising from the edge of the backyard. "Stay here," Nate said sharply. He grabbed the fire extinguisher by the back door and sprinted toward the fence. The shed was burning. It had started small, just a corner, some old tarps, but the flames licked greedily upward, catching the woodpile stacked nearby. Orange tongues curled toward the sky like something hungry. He didn't stop to think, didn't pause to ask how it started. He knew. The man. The warning. Another time, he'd said. This was it. Nate yanked open the latch and sprayed the flames with a sweeping motion. His eyes stung, his lungs rebelled, but the fire hissed and stumbled. He beat it back with everything he had, Foam, sweat, muscle memory. When the extinguisher emptied, he kept going, throwing dirt, stomping embers, ripping down the tarp. By the time it was out, the shed was half charred, the grass around it scorched. His arms shook. His shirt clung to him, soaked with effort. But the fire hadn't reached the house. Not this time. He heard Grace's voice before he saw her. "Nate!" She was running toward him barefoot, eyes wild. "The front, the porch, it's smoking?" He didn't ask how, just ran. Around the side of the house, smoke curled from the base of the porch steps. A smoldering rag stuffed into a tin can glowed red inside the lattice. A makeshift Molotov. Nate stomped it out with his boot, ripped the can from its hiding place, and flung it into the dirt. Then he stood there, chest heaving, watching as the smoke thinned into nothing. Grace caught up to him, breathing hard, holding Lily against her hip. The girl clung to her mother's shirt, confused and scared. Ava and Caleb stood by the door, eyes wide. "Is it over?" Ava asked. Nate turned slowly. His heart beat like war drums in his ears. "No," he said. "Not yet." They called Sheriff Whitaker. He arrived 10 minutes later, calm but stern, inspected the damage, took photos, listened quietly as Nate described the man, the threat, the words exchanged 2 nights ago. "I know who you're talking about," the sheriff said. "We've had complaints about him, threats, restraining orders that went unenforced." "Will he be back?" Grace asked, holding Lily close. Whitaker's jaw clenched. Men like that usually don't stop unless they're made to. Nate stepped forward. "Then let's make him." That night, Nate didn't sleep. Neither did Grace. They sat together in the living room while the kids finally dozed off. The fire in the hearth crackled low. The porch light was off. Every window was locked, every door barred. "I told myself I could protect them if I just kept moving," Grace whispered. "If I never stayed long enough to be found." Nate turned toward her, his face drawn and weary. "You were protecting them, and now you're not alone." She reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. "You should have left us," she said. "You had every reason to." "I know," Nate said. His voice was steady. "But I didn't, and I won't." She looked at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "Why?" He paused. Then, almost like it hurt to say, "Because this time, I'm not running from the fire, I'm standing in it. For you, for them, for me." A long silence settled between them, thick with the weight of choices, of losses survived, of things broken and slowly rebuilt. Then Grace leaned forward, her forehead touched his. They stayed like that. No kiss, no declarations. Just warmth, breath, and the quiet promise of not being alone. An hour later, the sound came again. Footsteps on gravel. Nate was already at the door before the knock. He opened it slowly. The man stood there, smirking, arms loose at his sides. "Looks like someone's playing family," he said. "Cute. You really think you can replace me?" "I'm not replacing anyone," Nate replied. "I'm protecting them," the man sneered. "You think this little town will keep you safe? You think a badge and a porch light matter to someone like me?" "No," Nate said. "But this does." He stepped outside and closed the door behind him. The man laughed. "You gonna hit me with that righteous fury, old man?" "No," Nate said. "I'm going to stop you." And then Caleb's voice cut through the air. "Don't touch him." The boy had opened the window upstairs, yelling into the night. The man flinched, startled. Then, suddenly, blue lights. Sheriff Whitaker pulled up behind him, cruiser lights flashing, gun holstered but hand on it. "That's far enough," Whitaker said, stepping out. "We've got enough evidence. You're done here." The man turned. "You siding with him?" "No," the sheriff said. "I'm siding with the law and the people who deserve peace." He cuffed the man without incident. The quiet ones always ended like that, not with screams but with handcuffs and silence. Grace stepped outside, holding Lily. Nate walked to her, arms scratched and soot-stained. She didn't say anything. She just leaned into him, head against his chest, and for the first time in years he let someone hold him after the fire. The house smelled like smoke for 2 days. Even with the windows open, even after scrubbing the porch and throwing out every scorched scrap of wood. It lingered, thin and bitter, a ghost clinging to the walls. Nate didn't try to hide it. Some smells weren't meant to be erased. The sheet was gone, burned nearly to the frame. The porch steps were blackened, one support beam cracked through the middle. He'd patched what he could, sanded down the worst of it, but the scars were still there. Same as his. The kid stayed close those first mornings. Caleb sat near the window, arms folded tight across his chest, watching the road like a soldier, on post. Ava followed Grace room to room, never letting go of the hem of her shirt. Lily stopped speaking for nearly a day. She just curled into whoever was nearest and closed her eyes, small and silent. Grace kept going, cooking, folding clothes, cleaning, but her eyes were rimmed red and her voice wavered when she whispered bedtime songs. Her strength hadn't left her, but it was stretched thin. Nate worked. He spent most of his time outside, hammering, sawing, carrying boards salvaged from the old barn behind the field. It was a kind of therapy, each nail driven into wood like a promise. You're still here. You're still standing. On the third morning, the doorbell rang. It startled all of them. Grace answered it slowly, hand resting on the frame. It was Eleanor, the elderly baker from town. In her arms, a basket of food, warm rolls, fresh eggs, a jar of jam, I heard, she said simply. Grace didn't ask who told her. Willow Creek was small. Grief traveled faster than gossip here. Eleanor glanced behind Grace's shoulder and met Nate's eyes. She gave a soft nod as if to say, I see you now. Nate stepped forward. I'm not asking for help, he said. That's good, Eleanor replied, because I'm not offering help. I'm offering home. He didn't know what to say, but Grace stepped aside and let her in. Later that day, others came too. Sheriff Whitaker returned with extra lumber from the station's shed. Charlie, the hardware store owner, dropped off paint and offered Nate use of his tools. A retired contractor brought old shutters. A teenage boy mowed the overgrown lawn. No one said much. No one asked for thanks. They just showed up. And just like that, the house was no longer a hiding place. It was becoming a part of the town again. That evening, Nate sat on the steps of the back porch, his hands aching from work. Sweat dried into salt lines across his shirt. The sun had dipped low, casting long gold shadows over the field. A breeze stirred through the trees. Grace joined him, sitting close, their shoulders barely touching. They came, she said quietly. They always do, Nate replied, when they see someone still worth standing for. She looked at him. You never asked why I stayed. After everything. He didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the grass. I figured you would when you were ready, he said. I'm ready now, she whispered. He turned to her, surprised by the softness in her tone. I stayed, she continued, because you didn't make me choose between being strong and being afraid. You saw both, and you didn't. Run. Nate looked down at his hands, scarred, steady. I've done enough running. Grace leaned into him. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, gentle but firm. She fit there like she'd been meant to. I didn't expect this, she said. Me neither. They sat in silence. Not the kind filled with tension or fear. This one was new. Easy. Earned. Ava burst through the screen door a moment later, hair flying barefoot. Mommy, she called. The tree. Grace stood. What about it? It's growing. They followed her out to the yard. At the far end, near the fence line, was the small birch sapling they had planted weeks ago. The yow, one they'd nearly forgotten in the chaos. Somehow it had survived the fire. New buds dotted its branches. Tiny, defiant green. Caleb stood beside it, hands in his pockets, looking down like he didn't quite believe it. Nate stepped forward. It held on, he said softly. Grace knelt beside the tree, her hand brushing one new leaf. "It's just a start. Starts are enough," Nate said. Ava skipped in a circle around the trunk. "Can we name it now?" Grace looked at Nate. He smiled. "What about the promise tree?" The kids nodded. Caleb didn't, but he didn't walk away either. Grace looked up at Nate, eyes full. "Then we'll keep that promise. All of us." He took her hand. The house behind them still smelled faintly of smoke, but beneath it, deeper, richer, was something else. Fresh earth, new lumber, bread baking, skin against skin. Life beginning again. The sound of hammers had a rhythm now. It echoed through the late summer air like music, offbeat, but alive. Laughter spilled from the porch. Footsteps shuffled over gravel. Somewhere inside, Lily banged. Two wooden spoons together in celebration of absolutely nothing. And somehow it all felt like victory. Nate stood at the edge of the yard, tool belt slung over his hip, watching a retired handyman from the diner balance a new porch beam with a precision that rivaled any architect's. Two teenage boys hauled lumber like they were on a mission. Grace handed out lemonade from the kitchen window with a towel slung. Over her shoulder, hair falling in soft waves. No one here was being paid. No one asked to be thanked, they just came. This was Willow Creek, and Willow Creek had decided to keep them. Inside, the house was beginning to breathe again. The broken staircase had been repaired with reclaimed wood, some of it from a barn that had once housed hay, others from a fence taken down 2 houses over. Nothing matched, but it didn't matter. The seams told a story. The back bedroom, which had once held only shadows, now had color. Ava had drawn a mural of handprints on the wall. Lily had added flowers, uneven but proud. Caleb built shelves with Nate, careful and deliberate, measuring, twice even when it wasn't needed. Grace moved through the house like someone settling into her skin. She cooked without rushing now, sang while folding laundry. She smiled when no one was looking, and sometimes when they were. Nate saw it all. He didn't speak of it, but he felt it in his bones, the slow hum of healing. Not fast, not loud, just steady, like the turning of a wheel long still. The town hosted a small gathering on a Saturday evening to welcome them properly, as Eleanor put it. They called it a picnic, but it looked like a backyard wedding without the vows. String lights hung between trees. Children played tag across the lawn. Nate brought out an old radio, and someone found a way to make it play again. Grace wore a blue dress that fluttered just past her knees. Her eyes met Nate's across the crowd, and something unspoken passed between them. Not romantic, not yet, but honest, certain. Like the first line of a letter not yet written. Sheriff Whitaker stood beside the grill flipping burgers as if arresting violent men was just a side job. When Nate offered to take over, he shook his head. "You've done enough," he said. "Let the town show up for you now." And they did. A mason dropped off nails and a new mailbox. The church choir donated curtains. Eleanor baked a cake shaped, like a tree. It was terrible looking and everyone loved it. Caleb didn't smile much, but he didn't hide either. Ava made friends with a girl named Rosie who invited her to school. Lily fell asleep in Grace's lap before the sun went down. A melted marshmallow still stuck to her cheek. When the night cooled, and most had gone home, Nate and Grace sat on the porch swing that Caleb had painted green, just like he said he would. They swayed in silence. It wasn't awkward. It was peace. "I used to think," Nate said, eyes on the stars, "that forgiveness meant forgetting." Grace turned toward him. "And now? Now I think it means building something even, when the past is still standing behind you." She nodded. "And not building it alone." They sat like that for a long time, hands close but not yet touching, as if neither needed to prove anything. The next morning, Nate took the kids to the promise tree. He brought a plaque, just a simple one, hand-carved from leftover porch wood. They knelt together in the dirt, even Caleb, and nailed it gently into the small post beside the growing birch. Promise tree. Where we choose each other, every day. Ava traced each word with her finger. Lily placed a pebble beside the roots like a treasure. Caleb cleared away some weeds without being asked. Grace stood back, hands shielding her eyes from the sun. She wasn't crying, but something in her face cracked open with pride. Nate stood beside her. It's not the past that defines them, she said. It's the love they get to grow up inside now. He nodded. They'll remember the fear, Nate said. But they'll remember the love louder. Grace looked at him, long and still, and then, like something finally gave way, she took his hand. No fireworks, no music, just skin against skin, real, unshaking. That night, as the wind moved through the trees, Nate sat alone in the living room with a cup of tea. The house didn't creak with sadness anymore. It just settled, like old bones that finally knew they were home. He glanced at the wall. The photo of him and Emily still sat on the shelf. He hadn't moved it, but he had added a second frame beside it. This one held a picture Ava had drawn. 6 stick figures holding hands beneath a tree. One of them wore a cowboy hat. One had pigtails. One had freckles. All of them were smiling. Nate leaned back, closed his eyes, and let himself feel it. Belonging. Not because he'd earned it, but because he'd chosen it. And this time, it had chosen him back. The first frost came quietly, just a trace of white across the porch railing, like breath caught and stilled. The grass crackled underfoot as Nate stepped out that morning, coffee in hand, sweater tugged over his shoulders. The sun was rising soft and slow over Willow Creek, painting everything in gold that didn't last long but felt like it should. Inside the house it was warm, not just from the firewood stacked high and burning in the old iron stove, but from life. The good kind. The kind you build from the ground up, even when the ground had once turned to ash. Grace was in the kitchen, humming to herself. Her hands kneaded dough on the counter, her sleeves dusted with flour. Lily toddled past with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a cape, pretending to be a hero. Ava sat at the table drawing something under a lamp's soft glow. And Caleb, as always, hovered at the edges, watching, half-guarded, but this morning he was smiling. Nate just stood there in the doorway taking it in. There had been a time, so many, too many, when he didn't think this version of life was meant for him. A time when all he could feel was heat and loss. When he only knew how to carry grief, not share it. But now, he moved to the kitchen, poured himself another cup of coffee. Grace glanced at him, the corners of her mouth lifting. She's making pancakes, she whispered, nodding toward Ava. She's in charge of breakfast today. Nate raised an eyebrow. Should I be worried? Terrified, Grace grinned. But we're letting her try. Good, he said. She deserves to. So much had changed. Not suddenly, but steadily, like a door left open long enough to invite in the light. That afternoon they all walked to the promise tree. The leaves were turning now, green to pale yellow, curling at the tips. Still small, still fragile, but alive. Taller than it had been. Sturdier. Ava brought water in, an old tin can, and poured it carefully into the dirt. Caleb cleared away fallen twigs, then handed Lily a pine cone he said was special. She held it like treasure. Grace stepped beside Nate, their arms brushing. It's almost been 2 months, she said softly. He nodded. Doesn't feel like it. Feels longer? She asked. No, he said, eyes on the tree. Feels like this is the part that was waiting to happen the whole time. I just didn't know how to get here. Grace's voice dropped to a whisper. And now that you're here? He turned to her. I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him then, really looked. Not with fear, or worry, or guarded hope, but with the steadiness of someone who believed him. I'm not either, she said. That night, the wind picked up. Leaves tapped against the windows and the air smelled like rain. Nate sat by the fireplace, sanding the surface of an old wooden table. It had belonged to his father once, then to him and Emily. For a long time, it had sat untouched in the corner, covered in dust. Now he was smoothing it back to life. Grace came in from the hallway, a blanket around her shoulders. She didn't say anything at first, just watched. "Thought I'd make it our dinner table again," Nate said. "It's not fancy, but it's solid." She ran her fingers over the grain. "It's beautiful." "It's honest," he said. They stood together a moment, side by side, hands resting on wood that had held so many lives. Meals, arguments, laughter, loss. Then Grace whispered, "I've been thinking." "Dangerous," Nate teased gently. She smiled. "I know we said we didn't have to define anything, but if we wanted to, we could make this official. For the kids. For us." Nate turned to face her. The fire cast light across her face, soft shadows, glowing eyes. "You mean?" He started, but she nodded before he finished. "Not a wedding, not right now. Not the kind with cake and dresses, just a commitment. To each other. To the home we've built. A choice." Nate reached into his pocket, then held up something. Small, a ring, simple, silver, clearly worn. "It was my wife's," he said. "I've carried it every day since." Grace looked at it, quiet. He took her hand, then placed the ring on a chain he'd already looped. He slipped it over her head. "It's not about replacing her," Nate said. "It's about adding something new. About making a promise of my own." Grace's eyes shone with unshed tears. "I promise too," she said. They stood there, hand in hand, as the fire crackled and the house hummed around them. Outside, the rain began to fall. Weeks later, winter arrived. Willow Creek settled into quiet rhythms, frosted windows, scarves on doorknobs, and the smell of cinnamon from Eleanor's bakery. Nate and Caleb finished rebuilding the shed stronger than before. Grace taught Ava how to bake bread without burning it. Lily spoke in full sentences now, often silly, often profound. On the first snow morning, the family stood at the back window, watching the world turn white. The promise tree stood tall, its leaves gone, but branches firm, holding their own against the cold. "Will it survive the winter?" Ava asked. "It already has," Grace said. Nate looked at her, and then down at the 3 children standing between them. And for once, there was no weight on his chest, just breath. Just life. That night, before turning in, Nate stepped outside alone. The stars were bright, sharp in the cold air. The porch creaked under his boots. He walked to the promise tree, knelt in the snow, and pressed one gloved hand to its trunk. Not a prayer, not even a thought, just gratitude. He stood slowly, turned back toward the house, and paused. Grace stood in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, smiling. He walked toward her. She held the door open. "Come home," she said simply, and he did.